And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And it's great to have Brian Kennedy back with us again. He was with us. Actually, I strolled through on our a couple of our videos, and I was looking through our parlor, and actually, he was our first guest that we actually posted on Play TV on Parlor, which is one of the many social media platforms that we use. But that was the end of December, really. So Brian, thanks so much for joining us once again, just over 3 months later when the world is very different.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's great to be with you. Love Hearts of Oak. Everybody loves it that I know. Thank you for doing what you're doing. It's extremely important. Yeah, it's a much different world from 3 months ago. A lot of my friends said every day seemed like Christmas. For those first weeks after President Trump was inaugurated, and it is a very entertaining time in American politics. It's a serious time too. There's a lot going on, and President Trump is not sitting back and just watching what's going on. Every single day that he's introducing something new to try to make America great again, and that sounds kind of cliche, but in his mind, he's thinking hard about what does it take to make the American economy strong? What does it take for Americans to have jobs? And so he's been relentless about this these last 3 months, especially
Well,
the last 2 months as president. And I was talking to some colleagues yesterday, and it seemed almost like of all the things that are going on, I'm sure we're missing some on a daily basis because he's not even promoting certain things; he's just doing them. Then people are discovering it like a week later. He signed something or passed something or had something, and so that's exciting for the country, and I would say by extension the world.
no, absolutely. And we'll get onto that because what happens in the US has ripples across the world,
Of course.
and huge implications for not only here in the UK but across Europe. Um, and just as a side tip on technical side, Brana, I love having you on because the your your technical side is spot on. Your video, your audio is just bang on, and I love it whenever you have a guest on that actually. And you're someone who doesn't engage in the media side to one end, but on the other end, actually, it always works when we talk. So,
Well, thank
thank you
you.
for ticking those boxes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have a face made for radio, so anytime I'm on video, I have to do my best here.
It always works. Always works. Your makeup department works wonders, Brian. It really
Exactly.
does.
They started early, so
But can I? So we are just in the UK. It's interesting because we have on Sky News, which was originally Rupert Maxwell's channel, connected with
yeah.
Fox News, and then got spun off and is now far away from any pro-American connection. But that has had a rolling ticker, 100 days of Trump. And it seems to every day in the UK, we are made aware of the increasing dangers of this individual with this rolling ticker, with the many podcasts on Sky News and the BBC are doing the same. I mean, what are your thoughts as an American before we delve into
Right.
the social side and the economic side, which has come out more recently, and the I guess the engaging in conflicts worldwide, and we'll touch on the Ukraine
Right.
Russia side.
Yeah.
But from your point of view as an American, how what's your perception on how the world has engaged and responded to President Trump?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because we Americans are pretty, in some ways, isolated from the rest of the world. We don't watch, we don't if someone says something happened in Europe, Americans don't typically care. If something happens well, I know we'll talk about Ukraine, but the Americans are not hung up on any of this. They won't know Ukraine on a map. They often say Americans aren't good in geography. Um, we're not good in geography unless we have to go fight a war. Then we get pretty good at it.
Well, the UK is you just go east and cross
Right.
over, and you'll hit
Right.
us
Right.
maybe, although we're quite small.
Right. Right. Well, look, Americans rightly live in a republic here in this country, and they're thinking primarily how to live their own lives. We shouldn't have to think about politics as much in this country as we do. We should have a much more stable system than we do. Or you might say the system is stable, but our politics have gone crazy. And I think Trump is going to have a certain stabilizing effect on that in this country. I think he's much more popular than people think in America. And so the Europeans are looking at all this and wondering what he's going to do to disturb the global order. But Americans don't really, I won't say they don't care. They do care at some level, but they send people to Washington to figure these things out. And so they don't think about these things themselves all that much. They're focused on running their businesses, raising their family, going to church on Sunday, coaching little league, all these things that are part of life in America. And we are our, we're not an island nation like Great Britain, but we are isolated over here, and we have the blessings of having a continent with Mexico and Canada to be relatively stable allies. And so we're protected by those two oceans. And so we focus primarily on making this country everything it can be. Now, I know the Europeans, I think President Trump for the Europeans is just good TV because he himself is good TV. He was arguing, was it Zelensky he was arguing with when he said this is going to make good TV, right? He's very self-conscious of these things and how this is going to play out. Nah, that's a real talent President Trump has, knowing how these things are going to play out, not only in America but around the world.
No, absolutely, and I think CNN, MSNBC also have missed the Trump effect on their ratings. And as much as they may be full on Trump derangement syndrome, they do miss the ratings that only Trump can bring. So we'll see how that develops in your
Right.
US media side. But I mean, you've the focus, my perception, please correct me and give your thoughts, but the
Yeah.
focus has been on a cultural pushback. And that's before we get onto the economic side. But it's been a massive pushback on the cultural issues in terms of maybe in terms of gender, in terms of renaming areas around America, in terms of that, and that seems to have been the focus. Is that a fair perception on how Trump has hit the road? I know we're 100 days in. It seems like a lifetime, but maybe the first month or so, it does seem as though he's hit on those cultural issues that certainly resonate with individuals.
Yeah, and I think those cultural issues were things that they're powerful indicators in society of the health of the country. Now, when he renames the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, that's just good, clean fun, right? That's just there's nothing too deep about that. He just wonders why the hell is that called Gulf of Mexico, not Gulf of America? When he
And
changed it,
and has a sign up in the Oval Office behind
right,
him.
right, right. It's just clean. It's good, clean fun. Okay, I can't. If the Mexicans want to call it Gulf of Mexico, knock yourself out. The big cultural things, though, you know, there's that saying that politics is downstream of culture. It's not. This is a mistake everybody makes. Andrew Breitbart said it, but other people said it before Andrew Breitbart. But our colleague Steve Bannon always mentions this, as do others. But he's wrong. He's wrong about that. And in this particular sense, that for Americans, we think about culture, we think of movies, we think of, maybe broad aspects of society. For the left, it's not about culture or politics. Everything is politics. Everything is politics. And they were recently pointing to Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, who made the point about, changing. If you change the culture, you'll set the political stage for a century. Something to that effect that Gramsci wrote. Well, think about it. Here's Gramsci, a political actor, not a cultural actor, saying that. So even though we somehow think politics is downstream of culture, the left thinks politics is going to shape culture for these people on the right. But in reality, it's all politics, always. It's all politics. And so we shouldn't be thinking about culture as something separate from politics. It's all politics. It shouldn't be necessarily, but it's all politics. In this country over the last decade, but really over the last 5 years, we've had this huge push, like on transgenderism. Where did that come from? Was that cultural? Was that something that had been happening in the culture over the last 20 years and then just manifest itself 5 years ago? Or did it come out of nowhere? And was it pushed politically by a group of people who had an agenda? And their agenda was not only to, I think, try to unite the left around this issue, but then to fundamentally alter how human beings live their lives and how they raise their children. And so you had this huge political push, not cultural push, but political push to turn children from boys into girls and vice versa. That was a political act by a small group of people. And they made a big, big mistake. They thought that that would unite the American left because the right would overreact somehow. It turned out Americans looked at that, left and right, and thought, that's insane. Boys are boys, girls are girls. Where did this come from? So they made a political error in trying to change how Americans live their lives. Now, I don't know in Europe if you have this huge push on transgenderism, but it's just so unnatural that in America, much of our political discussions over the last 4 years, and why President Trump is trying to fix that now, he says he's a common sense president engaged in a common sense revolution. Those so-called cultural things about transgenderism or the family or other broad things, he's really just trying to bring them back to common sense and reject this notion that modern science has foisted upon us, that somehow we can fundamentally change humanity through science. I
Well,
think COVID was partly that, but the transgender stuff is certainly that.
no, and you mentioned Europe, but I mean, is that a failure of the US to look abroad? Because we've had the transgender movement probably started, from my understanding, in the Netherlands in the 90s, and then the UK took that on board. So it's been the Netherlands and the UK that have pushed this agenda, and we've had gender reassignment clinics for a 15 plus years operating under a
Sure.
quasi legal system. But that was coming. Is that I'm I'm kind of want to get your thoughts on, is that a failure of the US to look abroad and see what is happening and to insulate the US from negative influences that are coming from elsewhere, because we live in a globalist economy and these trends travel country to country.
Yeah, it's a good observation. I don't know the answer. My guess is you can't insulate but just as you say, you can't really insulate Americans from bad ideas. Those bad ideas are going to happen. Um, it's just that it's not in very high percentages that this goes on even in Europe. It really takes something unusual happening in a society to try to turn your boys into girls through, castration and the use of chemicals to alter their bodies. That is so foreign to humanity that even though it was going on in Europe and people kind of knew about it, And there's always been some very small, part of that in the United States. The idea that it blew up and became so powerful here. I mean, in the 2020 election, all of a sudden, almost out of nowhere, it wasn't just Black Lives Matter, it was Black transgender lives matter. As if there was a somehow spike in violence against Black transgendered, men who were living as women. When of course everyone looked around and said, "Where did that come from?" As if they could just simply foist that upon us for political purposes. I will say I'm a huge fan of C.S. Lewis, and one of my favorite. I mean, his whole space trilogy I think is simply brilliant. But you look at that hideous strength, and you see a world where people are willing to alter humanity in rather fundamental ways, and they do so basically because of demonic forces operating in England at the time, but presumably globally at the time. I think we were living through that hideous strength for the last 4 years, last 20 years, maybe still to this day. These things are very powerful. There's some very dark forces at play throughout the world and in the United States, where otherwise sensible people have embraced something that is so unnatural. And um, a lot of people just, I meet people all the time that say, this just seems demonic to me, demonic. And people out of nowhere will say to me, have you read C.S. Lewis? So they look to a man who wrote Christian allegories to try to understand the world they're living in today, because it's hard to explain. And thankfully, I think Americans are waking up to the notion that this is not just a one-off, but a more serious problem in society. But I think one, by the way, and this will probably be true of Europe too, that discredits both social science, the people who are advocating it on a broad level, but real science or medical science, let's just say, doctors who are allowing this or encouraging this to happen. And to that extent, that should be a great worry to people, that the kind of science we actually need at times, not always, but at times, is being discredited. And I see a big push in this country, by the way, towards natural medicine and natural healing. And I think that's in no small part because medical science, big pharma especially, discredited itself here in the United States over the last decade. And witness the fact that Robert Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, someone who thinks vaccines are dangerous. Even though he believes in vaccines, he thinks some of them, many of them, not all of them, are not manufactured correctly and therefore dangerous, and that there are many, many natural alternatives to the agenda that big pharma has been foisting upon people. How about living a healthier life rather than just giving people a pill when they're overweight or when they have high blood pressure, et cetera?
Well, let me pick up on that about Bobby Kennedy and his role. Um, and look, Brand, anyone who like C.S. Lewis, I'm a huge. I grew up with Narnia series, and read time and time again every 7 books of that, and of course the Cosmic Trilogy, which you referred to. And he is a phenomenon in certainly in England and worldwide, and of course grew up in Belfast. So let me put that
Of
in
course,
for my
yes,
Northern
yes,
Ireland connection.
yes, yes,
Um,
yes.
but Bobby Kennedy, what he's been given a role, and it's interesting because he is when you look at Bobby and maybe Elon Musk, Bobby Kennedy is someone who seems to head down to get the job done. Elon Musk, maybe because of X, because of Twitter, he's someone who maybe seeks the spotlight a bit more. But Bobby and what he's been tasked with is huge. How is that actually developing? How does that engage with the media? Because Make America Healthy Again seems to be and everyone can sign up to that. And
Right.
yet, I'm sure your media have found ways of pushing back against that common sense idea.
The media is not pushed back much yet because he's sort of building his team still, and he's still I think laying out a lot of the plans for what he plans to do. But I think in general, he's uh, he's trying to completely rethink how you divorce big pharma and a reliance on pharmaceuticals to live a better life, and really trying to point Americans in the direction of, instead of just taking pills and having surgeries, what have you, how do you lose weight? How do you eat healthier, more broadly? What is in the food supplies in this country? I mean, right now in this country, testosterone levels, and I think this is probably most of the Western world, are down 50%. Now, under most circumstances, you say stop. It's down 50%. Something's going on. What is it? Is it the food, i.e., environmental? Is it the water, also environmental? Is it vaccines, something that we've given to people? Is it the effects of electromagnetic frequencies? These are all things that Robert Kennedy talks about, and that I personally am deeply concerned about.
Oh, you're taking us far down the rabbit hole. 100% agree. He's got so much on his plate.
Right, but those are no small things, right? What goes in the water? Microplastics. And you kind of take some of these things for granted, and you'll think, well, well, no, this is actually, you know, what does it mean to live the good life? We want each human being in this world to live a good life. What does that start with? Starts with being a moral and decent person, but also one that's healthy enough to be able to provide for themselves and their family, and to have the sort of health and consciousness to understand what the good life is even all about. That I think is something that we have forgotten in this country, and I think in the West. I think Europe still has some concern and care when it comes to their food supplies, but I think not enough. All of us, not enough. And we have to be monitoring what goes in the water and what really is the effect of electromagnetic frequencies on the human body. These are no small things, and we may find that there's no effect. Great, let's move on. Let's figure out what that is. But in this country, we've had an explosion of cancers among young people. I'm not a medical doctor, let me just say, but just reporting this is, the health agencies report this, an explosion of cancers among young people. 13-year-olds getting colon cancer. If there was one, you'd say, well, that was an anomaly. If you have two, just two, that's a problem, because these things don't happen to young people. Robert Kennedy is concerned about all these things. President Trump is concerned about all these things. So here's a guy in Trump who's a capitalist who everyone thinks is just about business and money and the bottom line. He appoints Robert Kennedy because President Trump wants you to live a good, healthy life. And in a commonsensical way, wouldn't a free people want to evaluate what it means to be healthy and to not rely on big pharma, which may be part of the problem, which indeed probably is part of the problem, if not the problem in all this, or certainly part of the problem anyway, let me say. And so this is a very unusual kind of administration, especially headed by a Republican who cares about all these, let's just call them holistic things that human beings should be concerned about. I think the kind of things Robert Kennedy will uncover in this country will benefit the health of the whole world, frankly. And good on him for driving in that direction, and he needs as much help as possible among the American people in doing that.
No, I agree. I think this is the worldwide, and I connecting with the health, and you mentioned on cancer, and a number of friends sent me one of the latest interviews with Tucker Carlson, which was Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong. I think I've maybe pronounced that incorrectly, but he talks about making billions on cancer treatments, and he is saying where we are decades later, actually we are no better, and we are told that one in two of us will get cancer, and instead of just blasting our immune system to oblivion, maybe there is a different way. And I've really enjoyed his interview with Tucker, actually explaining actually what may be behind this and what may be the issues, and let's maybe think differently. Because again, we are drawn to an expert in a field, and with them saying, actually, maybe what we've done for decades is not correct. And to me, something like that is a huge opening to Bobby Kennedy, to Trump, to actually begin to ask questions of how the the health industry works, not necessarily for making people healthy, but actually keeping them contained in that sick cycle. That's what it seems to be.
Yeah, no, that's a. I think it's Patrick Soon-Shiong, but I live in Los Angeles here, and he was a professor of health at UCLA in their medical school, and he invented these two cancer drugs and made billions of dollars. And among other things, he bought the
I
LA
wish
Times.
I made billions of dollars or something
Yeah,
like
I
that.
know, I know.
Anyway, that's to the side.
Next week we'll get to it. We'll get to that next week. But he also bought the LA Times, and is not a man of the right in any way, shape, or form. You'd probably say he was a man more of the left, or probably you'd say he's more of a scientist.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. You have Patrick Soon-Shiong, and you have Elon Musk, and they're both from South Africa, and they're both living now in the United States and prospering, becoming billionaires, and not really political men per se. Really, one Elon Musk, of course, an engineer, Sun Xiang, a doctor, medical scientist, and they both look at the world we're living in and they think, I mean, they're entrepreneurs and they're very talented, brilliant guys, but they're also looking at the world they're living in, which has given so much to them, and they think, man, this place is falling apart. Sun Xiang looks and says, Big Pharma they've got cancer treatment wrong. And the medical profession has rejected any alternative to what they've been doing for the past 30 years when it comes to cancer, and to any alternative to the big pharma agenda. And in that interview, which I thought was going to get much more attention, it should get a lot of attention. I'm really glad you brought it up, because here you have a guy who is not part of big pharma, not a conservative, a real medical scientist saying this stuff is all wrong and we've got to fix it now. He offered to give all these alternative medicines to the Biden administration during COVID. They'd have none of it. He said he offered to give them to Obama. He'd have none of it. And now here he is talking to Robert Kennedy on an active basis to try to get it right. And I'd be very surprised if some of the things he was talking about won't be embraced warmly by the Trump administration. Because just in a commonsensical way, why wouldn't you try to get this right? And then you have Musk. Musk looks around the world. He's made these big investments. People aren't going to buy Teslas or anything that he produces if the American economy goes to hell. And Musk, it wasn't like Musk fell in love with Donald Trump one day. Musk just thought the country is in a very bad spot. It can't continue to spend money like this. The Democrats are driving the economy over a cliff. And this Trump guy, he makes a lot of sense. And there may have been some, what you call cultural things that drove him Trump's way within his own family, transgenderism, what have you, and just the experience of raising, I don't know how many kids he has, over 10, I think.
Lots.
Lots, yeah. So he's free in many ways, apparently. But he looks and he thinks, we have a lot to get right. So that's kind of encouraging in a way, right? There's a can-do attitude among a certain kind of person. who are not just going to sit back and let these things destroy the country, that they're going to help get it right. So when you look at Robert Kennedy, I think he's going to be hearing from all sorts of really smart people on how to make this thing work. And the fact that he's looks the picture of health himself is a very encouraging thing,
He is
right?
probably our most healthy health secretary you've ever had. Yeah, to as a 70-year-old to be ribbed as he is, it's wow. You look at that,
It's in-
but
It should be encouraging for a lot of Americans. Lead
ab-
by example. I love it. No, it's great.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I want to ask you, and we talked before we aired on the economic side, on the trade side, and of course, a
Sure.
lot has happened. That we're half an hour into having a conversation, but I want to ask you about that and how you perceive it, because President Trump has talked about tariffs, which are reciprocal tariffs on what other nations have put on that. And I watched the discussions in the US on Wall Street is in collapse. It's fallen by 3%. The world is ending. Well, tomorrow it will bounce up by 2%, so it's irrelevant. But how do you perceive that? Because this is the first economic salvo really that Trump has done. Up to now, my perception anyway, it's been more cultural. And this is the first economic salvo. So do you see, is that a correct assessment? How do you see what's happened over the last few days?
Yeah, the really encouraging thing is President Trump doesn't seem so worried about Wall Street and the stock market and it going up and down, and that he doesn't believe now it's his job. He never did, but he doesn't think it's his job to make sure the stock market keeps going straight up, that it can go up and down, that it will fluctuate. He has had this one consistent idea, and that is it's very important for Americans to have jobs. That I won't say that's the beginning and the end of his economic policy, but pretty close. He wants you to have a good job so that you can raise a family with it. And what do you do when you do that? You spend money. You get all the money keeps going round and round and round. He's not saying you can't buy goods from other countries. He's just saying it'd be really good to make a lot of these things in the United States. And how do I encourage people to produce things again in the United States? And so America is a big country, and a lot of people see it as New York with its skyscrapers, and LA with its beaches, and Washington with its monuments, and Florida and South Beach and Miami and what have you, Palm Beach with where the president lives. And it looks like a very glamorous place. But you go around the rest of the country, and
Maybe
there's some
forget about
very
Montana.
well, Montana is beautiful in its own right, right? But it's never Montana's never been developed, right? It's a big, beautiful place, obviously. But you go to other parts of the country, parts of Chicago, parts of Detroit, parts of the industrial Midwest, big parts of the South, the American South, and you see very poor places, places where used to have manufacturing that don't anymore. And President Trump looks at that and he thinks, what about those people? They don't live in LA and they don't live in New York, and they're not going to be stockbrokers, and they're not going to be running hedge funds, and they're not going to be designing computer code to make new video games or to make new, operating systems for Apple. That's a pretty finite group of people. And so President Trump looks at that, and the tariffs are the first piece. He's signaling to the American entrepreneur, make things here. You'll have a fair shot to do it. We're gonna. It's not that so much we're protecting your industry, but we're going to give you a more level playing field in which to operate. You saw the high tariff on Vietnam. A lot of our clothes now come from Vietnam, a lot from China, of course, but a lot of the everyday t-shirts and stuff people wear coming from Vietnam, shirts, dresses, what have you, are coming from there. And so Could these things be produced in the United States? Absolutely. President Trump saying, with this tariff, you can now do that. Very encouraging in a lot of ways to American manufacturing. The second thing, which I think will get rolled out probably over the next 6 months, I hope, is his whole idea of freedom cities, which has been talked about only here and there. But the freedom cities are all about, again, big country. Let's build more cities. We have all this federal land. Let's not us build them, we the US government, but let us allow American entrepreneurs to build new cities. Now, what will happen then? People will move out of the big cities. They'll start new cities. Housing prices will be less. Um, Presumably, they'll build nice communities where you can raise families, right? In the big, you see this happening already in Colorado and the West, California, Arizona, Texas, Florida. But find those places where Americans can spread out. Well, what kind of economy will that create? That'll create people building homes. Those are jobs. And with the homes being built, you'll need supermarkets. You'll need, you know, all the ancillary economic, you know, enterprises that help service any kind of city at its most basic level. And then with lower housing costs, because one of the key components to manufacturing are how much do you have to spend to employ people, and their biggest cost is housing. How do you lower their housing costs and then make manufacturing attractive in those places? So a combination of the tariffs and building new cities and lowering the housing stock of the whole country, right? In theory, houses should stabilize in price, and in those areas where the new ones are being built, they should be pretty affordable. That's great for business. Great for business, great for young families, great for people who want to have kids, great for new immigrants who want to come be part of the American dream. This is about fulfilling the American dream at the end of the day. Having a job, having a family, having a house, having all those things that lead to what I referred to earlier as the good life. President Trump thinks of that whole package. For the better part of 40 years, 50 years, we have been basically taking the wealth of the United States and the manufacturing base and exporting it abroad, as we well know. And in that process, we've taken away from people who used to work in those jobs their chance for the American dream. If you're smart, and there's a lot of smart people still in this country, thank God, you're going to be working for hedge funds, and you're going to start new businesses already, and you're going to start, be computer coding in Silicon Valley and making movies and drilling for oil and all the things that make America prosperous. But that's only a small percentage of the economy that are capable of doing that. Other people have to be able to work for those entrepreneurs who are willing to risk their capital to start new businesses that, again, by new businesses, not just like restaurants and, yogurt shops and these service things, but actual manufacturing where you're taking a raw materials, and making a product that sells in a market. That's where real wealth is created. Service economies, I would humbly argue, mostly trade dollars between people, whereas manufacturing is creating real wealth because you're taking a raw material that's only worth so much and turning it into a finished product that people in a free market want to buy. That's where real wealth is created and where you're able to, therefore, employ people at a much higher wage to produce continually better products. And that's the thing we used to do that we don't do now. That really does inform how President Trump thinks about all this. He wants those people back. And he thinks, you know, there was a globalist system for many years, obviously, that thought it would be just good for the world to have all those people make that money rather than us. And
No,
that didn't happen.
absolutely, and I'm in the UK, which is a service industry, but I'm up for building a new town. I think my preferences may be for West Virginia and Texas. So I'm up for partnering with you, Brian, and maybe doing some kind of utopian establishment town somewhere in one of those two. And I know you're far away from those two.
Yeah, I'm far away from those 2, but, like, for instance, right now, I'm wearing a pair of Crockett& and Jones shoes that are made in England, and they're my favorite shoes. I have a bunch of them, and, my wife makes fun of me for it. But they're made in England, and they're made by craftsmen who have a great deal of pride in what they do, and they're very, very high quality. And my guess is the people who work at that factory are doing pretty well. Okay. England used to do a lot of that. The Europeans used to do a lot of that. Americans used to do a lot of that. Okay. That would be a good thing to do again for America and the West. And if we think that the only thing that matters is producing low cost goods in China or in Asia, and then being able to buy a lot of things, that I think is not so good. I think it's better to buy a few quality goods than a bunch of low quality goods. John Adams worried about Americans buying baubles, meaning things that were not really important for their way of life.
Like Temu.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah, just seeing something online for $5 and then going and buying it and filling your house full of a bunch of things that are not exactly absolutely necessary
Oh, I
and spending a lot of money on it rather than producing those things, in your own country that you absolutely need, like
and
cars, etcetera.
I know, and I hope that what is the focus on President Trump actually has an impact on not only the UK but Europe, that have actually shipped out a lot of the manufacturing elsewhere, and maybe they will think actually there's a positivity to actually having manufacturing in your own backyard. Then you don't have to bring it from the other side of the world. But Brad, I can't let you leave without asking you about um, the global situation in terms of war, in terms of what we've looked at Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, you've got really a tinderbox still in Israel, but that has been there since 67, since Israel was there, and 3,000 years before. So that is a long history. Maybe
Right.
the conflict with Ukraine and Russia is is a little bit newer. And President Trump has talked about actually solving these issues. With Israel, it's a little bit difficult because you have, and we've had Robert Spencer on many times, and you look at Islam being the crutch of that problem. In terms of Ukraine and Russia, it is more about land, and that's why maybe can be discussed a little bit more. And President Trump has talked about having a peace deal. We saw Zelensky ejected from the Oval Office fairly quickly, and the horror of the Europeans saying, "Oh, how dare you treat someone like that?" And President Trump saying, "Well, maybe you should turn up in a suit." That may be a response to that. But how do you see that development? Because the Europeans have largely funded that proxy war against Russia, and the US under Biden have been very much part of that. And President Trump seemed to have said enough is enough. How do you see that develop? Because there's a huge conflict.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point. It's not that President Trump doesn't care about the Ukrainians, and it's not that he trusts the Russians. Like all this stuff about Vladimir Putin, I mean, everyone this is a roundabout way of answering it. President Trump would call it the weave. But the one way of thinking about it is everybody accuses President Trump because he doesn't want to engage in a full-on war, a land war with Russia. Whatever President Trump says, they become Putin talking points. And then whatever his critics say, this is just, apparently the truth sent down by God. That, obviously America and the West should risk thermonuclear war to defend the Ukrainians. Okay. When you look at everything that's going on, President Trump is simply saying, we're not going to stop the Russians. We're not going to engage in thermonuclear war to get Russia out of parts of Ukraine. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to risk World War III in the kinetic ways that are possible today. Now, he says that in part not because the Russians are at all admirable at anything they're doing. They're not. But he's partly saying America is not prepared. The state of our preparedness is nowhere near where it should be. We were talking about that I had mentioned to you that interview with Andrei Ilyanov with some British interviewers, and he was describing the fact that the NATO countries, including the United States, produce only 25% of the munitions that the Russians do. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? America is a big country with a huge industrial capacity. The European countries have industrial capacity. In Russia, who we always think of as kind of backwards, they're outperforming the West by a lot, the NATO by a lot, which might mean that they're serious about this. The Russians are producing advanced aircraft. They're producing advanced nuclear weapons. They have cruise missiles. They have hypersonic reentry vehicles that they can equip with nuclear weapons. The Russians care a lot about war and winning wars. And even when they fight wars and lose a lot of people, they have capacity for doing a lot of things. And they're in a strategic alliance with Communist China. The Russians are. And President Trump looks at all that and he thinks, interesting. When's the last time we tested our nuclear weapons? 1992. And we think, I wonder if those things work. How are we in producing aircraft? He just introduced a new aircraft, the F-47, that is going to be just fabulous. It's going to be fabulous probably when he leaves office, not while he's president, making these hard decisions. President Trump thinks these nuclear weapons are a bad thing. The Russians have them, a lot of them, more than we do. And the Chinese have an untold number of nuclear weapons, right? They keep using a low number, but I believe that they have a very high number of nuclear weapons now because they have the industrial capacity and the wealth to do so. So what does President Trump say? We need a Golden Dome missile defense for the United States. And we need to operate that and build that quickly and do everything in our power to make that a reality. He's also underscoring the fact that we don't have one today. We have a very limited missile defense in this country today that can stop one or two missiles launched from North Korea. We cannot stop Russian missiles launched at the United States. We cannot stop Chinese missiles launched at the United States. We could not stop an Iranian missile launched from a ship at the United States. We can't stop those because the elites in Washington within our defense establishment didn't think that was important. And the Democrats who were controlling all those things while in power didn't fund them, didn't believe in them, believed in leaving us exposed to ballistic missile attack. This is an important point for your audience. The Russians today have 7,000 interceptors around Moscow, ballistic missile interceptors around Moscow that will defend 75% of the Russian population. So that if war comes, they're pretty confident they could survive that war. So much so that we might be deterred from using weapons against them. The Chinese have a crude but effective missile defense. It should be it should be at least estimated because they with such close alliances with Russia could certainly replicate that kind of a missile defense in their country. But they also have the ability to send large parts of their population into underground shelters in the event of nuclear war. And they have the capacity to launch nuclear weapons. Okay, everything I've said is an open source kind of understanding of this that we talk about. I'm chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. I'm also a member of the Independent Working Group on Missile Defense and have been for 20 years. And it's not that I'm so interested in these things from sort of a military point of view. I'm more interested in them from what does it take for America to survive? Just sort of in a commonsensical way. I have no sort of fixation on this stuff, but how do you defend America? And there is this glaring omission when it comes to missile defense. Reagan talked about it in '83. He said it's better to prevent a nuclear attack than to retaliate against one. Straight common sense. Margaret Thatcher agreed. And yet here we are today, vulnerable to ballistic missile attack by communist China and Russia, and to a lesser degree, Iran and North Korea. President Trump, when informed about all this, he was a business person. He thought that the great minds in Washington were dealing with this. When he learned that they weren't, what did he start in his first administration? The Space Force. And then we have 4 years of the Biden administration engaging in a very provocative war with Ukraine, in Ukraine with the Russians. I think President Trump would have just logically thought, well, okay, if these people are going to engage in this kind of a war so provocative to the Russians, they would at least carry on the Space Force, and they should be at least investing. They're spending a lot of money. They must be building a missile defense. Because why would you engage in war with a nuclear power and not have a missile defense? And of course they didn't, because they don't believe in it. Joe Biden never believed in missile defense. Of course, the Russians believe in it. The Chinese believe in it. The only country that doesn't believe in it is us, the United States. And so what's one of the first things he mentioned? He did it last week. The whole idea of a golden dome, a missile defense that will defend the United States, that will eventually be able to defend also our allies. Okay, once you're able to do that, you're in a much better position to start supporting Ukraine or to influencing events throughout the world. Now we may get in a war before then, before that missile defense is built. But I think everything President Trump is doing diplomatically is designed to buy us as much time as possible to build that missile defense, to build our armaments, to build our Air Force and our Navy, and make sure that's first rate. We may not have the time. We may be forced to do it before then. But if there's a strategic objective, it is to be as prepared as possible. World War II, America gets attacked at Pearl Harbor. It takes a while to respond, doesn't it? It takes a few years to respond to the Japanese because you're not prepared. You lose a lot of your Navy, at Pearl Harbor. So you have to rebuild. Right now, we're at a point where we are rebuilding. And if we can build that missile defense for America and our allies, we will be in a much better spot to secure the peace that we would like to see throughout the world, that President Trump would like to see throughout the world. Because he looks at the war in Ukraine and just thinks the Russians are not going to give it up. In the Ukraine, people make all sorts of strategic mistakes in war. It would be a horrible thing if we engaged in a nuclear war with the Russians or the Chinese. It'd be an awful thing, be a stupid thing. But who knows? It might come to that. And we like to make sure that it doesn't come to that. And to the extent that we're prepared, and it may take a few years, may take 6 months, If I were running the Missile Defense Agency, I'd have something up in 6 months. I'd put Elon Musk and Palmer Luckey, two genius engineers we have in this country, put them on the job of putting up some limited system. With enough money, they could do it, and they could do it quickly. If you want to do it bureaucratically, it'll take a decade. President Trump is being presented with these options as we speak. And at the Committee on the Present Danger China, we've been encouraging a, a rapid building and deployment of a missile defense system, just for pure commonsensical reasons.
Yeah.
And so I'm encouraged. It's one of the things I'm encouraged most about. And we don't want Ukraine to be lost to the Russians. And we want the Russians to live in peace and harmony and with the goodwill of other nations. We'd like the same from the Chinese. It's just that the Russians and the Chinese aren't doing that today. And they're armed with nuclear weapons and advanced militaries. China has fifth generation aircraft.
Yeah.
There's we were talking about movies and shows and documentaries and these podcasts. There's a Chinese movie called Born to Fly that I'd kind of recommend. It's like their version of Top Gun. And it came out, I think, 2 years ago now. But it shows a China that believes it can build advanced aircraft, and they can, and have very sophisticated pilots, and they do. And their pilots are all engineers. And in the movie, they're all surfing on the beach, and they all have pretty girlfriends, and it's literally like Top Gun, the Chinese version of Top Gun. But they're showing it to their people. Very popular in China. And what are they signaling? That if you work hard, you can be an engineer, you can be a pilot, you can fight for the fatherland. You can be, a Top Gun. We can be a great country, we communist China. We can be rulers of this earth. So when we look at culture, that's an interesting cultural thing. I'll say that's a cultural reference. But it's a very political thing by the Chinese Communist Party to produce, right? Is that a cultural message or a political message? They're signaling to their people that war may come and that we're going to be ready to fight it and that we are serious. And the only thing I'll say about the movie is, the pilots are happy, they're handsome, they're hardworking, they're energetic to be the best. That's China today. And that is not something to be discounted because much of the West is fixated on things that don't really matter much in the great scheme of things. Whether it's, consumerism or transgenderism or any of these sort of strange fixations we've had lately, that now is the time to get serious. And one of the virtues of Donald Trump is he sees the world in a serious way. Much more serious, I think, than anyone else in my lifetime. And he does so during a period where a lot of Americans are not, they don't have a great understanding of that. They don't think their civilization can be lost, but it can. And so it's rebuilding intellectually the country. Is Trump never says that, but it's really what he's doing, rebuilding the country intellectually to appreciate that this is a good country and a great country, and that unfortunately it can be lost if you don't take it seriously.
Absolutely. And Brian, I love your work on the Committee of Present Danger of China. And I think Pete Hegsworth is got a huge role in fixing and restoring US
Right.
military. And I watched that F-47 press conference. Personally, I would, as a plane buff, I would like to be an Air Force one day, but well, I don't know if I'd like to be in an
Mm.
F-47 on the back. I'll stick with Air Force One. But Brian, thank you so much for your overview. So much happening. And I love what you bring to War Room. You bring something so different to Steve. That actually Steve is very much bombastic. Let's burn this to the ground. You're very different, and I love that which MAGA brings those different voices to the conversation. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for everything you're doing. It's always a pleasure to be with you.